Welcome, my friends. Silouan here. We are back in Job. This will be part 4. When we left off in part 3, we had just ended with chapter 19, where kind of suddenly Job had kind of had a change of attitude. And it ended with, "For wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment." And it sounded like for a second that Job was kind of coming to grips what had happened to him. And now we kind of have a pause from what had been going on. Job trying to understand what he had done and what he was going through. And in chapter 20, this kind of starts with his friend Zophar, and then it will continue on into chapter 21 and on, where now it's kind of a discussion just in general. What is wicked? What is a wicked person? Do wicked people deserve this punishment? You can tell they're trying to understand, is there maybe something going on here with what God has done to Job that he's trying to get us to understand in a bigger picture. And so Zophar begins verse 4 here in chapter 20. "Do you not know this of old, since man was placed on earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite is but for a moment?" And then he goes on to describe what a wicked person is, and that maybe God's judgment is to remedy that. You know, that in a sense, he goes on about what's wicked and why a wicked person sort of deserves what they get. And then describes a very wicked person. A very wicked attitude of somebody, being very selfish. And then Job enters the conversation. He wants to comment on what a wicked person is. "As for me, is my complaint against man? And if it were, why should I not be impatient? Look at me and be astonished. Why do the wicked live and become old? Yes, become mighty in power. Their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes." So Job agrees. And he says, yes, wicked people deserve to be punished, but then he asks a pretty obvious question. But then why do so many of them do well? Why do so many wicked people do well? He hears, Zophar trying to explain to him, wicked kind of have it coming. It doesn't last very long. Eventually the wicked get punished. And Job's like, well, really? I see a lot of good thing happening to wicked people. And he ends this in chapter 20 with, "How then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in yours?" Okay, now we're coming right back. Now they're coming to Job again, Old Zophar here tried to get away from Job and just explain, hey, wicked people deserve what they get. And then Job's like, well, hold on a minute there, but they don't always get what they deserve. And then Eliphaz comes in and he basically begins to accuse Job. "Can a man be profitable to God, though he who is wise man be profitable to himself? Is it any pleasure to the Almighty that you are righteous, or is it gain to him that you make your ways blameless? Is it because of your fear of him that he corrects you and enters into judgment with you? Is not your wickedness great and your iniquity without end?" And basically, what's interesting, because we're going to end today, how far am I going? We're going to about chapter 31 today. And as we go through this, basically what this back and forth argument becomes is that at the end of the day, man by nature is just bad. Doesn't matter what he does. It's kind of a depressing thought if you think about it. But though he is a wise man, may be profitable to God himself. Is there any pleasure to you, the Almighty, that you are righteous? Basically, it's you're so insignificant to God. Why do you think your goodness could rise to a level that God is just going to universally bless you and bad things aren't going to happen to you? Do you really think you can become so good that you are assured of nothing bad happening on earth? "You are acquainted yourself with him and be at peace. Thereby good will come to you. Receive, please, instruction from his mouth and lay up his words in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be built up. You will remove iniquity far from your tents. When they cast you down and you say, exaltation will come. Then he will save the humble person. And so what Eliphar is basically saying to Job is your big problem here is your lack of humility. Rather than looking at where you fall short and what you need to work on, all you're doing is looking at what you do great. So you're going, here's a wicked man, and you create like this stereotype of a wicked man and what it is, and you go, well, I'm not that. But what you're doing is you're not giving yourself the transparency of self. I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. That you're creating this straw man and going, I'm not that. And in doing so, you're avoiding looking at yourself in an honest way. You are lacking humility. And then Job, he's like, he can't get there. He can't get to the point where he says, I'm lacking humility. He still has to justify himself. Even today, my complaint is bitter. Therefore, I am terrified at his presence. When I consider this, I am afraid of him. For God made my heart weak, and the Almighty terrifies me, because I was not cut off from the presence of darkness, and he did not hide deep darkness from my faith. He can't look at himself. He wants to blame God. He wants to blame God for his lack of understanding. He wants to blame God for everything that's happened to him. He can't take any ownership of anything. There are those who rebel against the light. They do not know its ways nor abide in its paths. And now what he does, again, trying to take the light off himself, which isn't that what we all do? Isn't gossip pointing a finger at somebody else? I think that's what's so dangerous about our world today. There are so many labels and so many people and so many problems and politics and you name it that we can point our finger at and go, my problem is that person, or worse, we characterize people. You're worse than me, so it justifies what I do. And we take light off ourselves. Well, that's what Job begins to do. There are those who rebel against the light. They do not know its ways nor abide in its paths. Look at those people over there who don't follow the light. Now, it is not so who will prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing. I mean, think about how full of pride he is, even though he's broken down. Rather than looking at him and himself, he says, look at those people. And then he ends this little section with saying, now prove me a liar. Show me where my speech is wrong. He's so sure of himself. And can't we get that same place? Think of how many arguments we see online, how many political talks, things on religion, things on all sorts of things. And both sides are so self-righteous. Both sides are like, I'm right. And neither one is able to look at themselves, honestly. Well, this is when Bildad comes in and basically tries to show him, really, you can be so righteous that you have nothing to get out of your own eye, going to the New Testament. You can be so righteous in pointing out what's wrong with others. You can't look in the mirror and tell what's wrong with you. How then can man be righteous before God? Or how can he be pure who is born of a woman? If even the moon does not shine and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man who is a maggot and a son of man who is a worm. Now what he's doing there is comparing man to God. And basically he's saying, look at how we see a maggot. Yet, think we kind of all share the same origin. Well, if a maggot to us just looks like something that can be stepped upon and cast aside and disparaged, what do we look like to God? How simple must we seem? Not only that, how inane must our arguments with this thing that we can't even begin to understand? And then Job comes back, and it's amazing. He's going 6 ways, in many different ways to try to understand all this. Indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper and hear of him, and the thunder of his power, who can understand? Well, that kind of hits Job. He kind of begins to go, yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe it is hard to understand God. Now, he's not quite at the place where he goes, well, then everything bad that's happened to me is okay. But at least he's willing to step back for a second and go, yeah, you're right. How could I truly understand this thing that's God that created all of these things? My lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. And then he's catching himself. I think he realizes how he's starting to sound Job and questioning God like he's doing. And so he says, but you're not going to hear anything bad come out of my mouth. In spite of my questions, in spite of my despair, in spite of my anger, I am not going to curse God. I am not going to say wicked things. As God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter. As long as my breath is in me and the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me that I should say, you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity. My righteousness I hold fast and will not let go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. Hold on a minute here. I'm maybe a little bit more humble than what you think. But is he? Because now Job begins what in the New King James they call it a discourse on wisdom. Man puts an end to darkness and searches every recess for one in the darkness and the shadow of death. But where can wisdom be found? Because now he's really starting to think, okay, what am I missing here? Where do I find wisdom? I obviously don't understand what's going on. And, if you read this honestly, I think that's what most people would say. What's going on? I don't understand. I'm looking into this darkness of Job. Where's the reasoning here? That's what Job's saying. Man puts an end to darkness and searches every recess for no one in the darkness, for war in the darkness and the shadow of death. But where can wisdom be found? And then at the end of what's chapter 28, a very famous verse, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And depart from evil is understanding. And really, I think what that's saying, and it's something I talk about a lot when I do leadership classes, how the most important quality of leadership is humility. In a sense, we can't begin to face our own weaknesses, our own shortcomings. And we can't begin to understand our place to God without humility. And ultimately, humility comes with fear. That's a hard thing to hear, isn't it? Because we think of fear as, like an abusive father. I'm scared of you, I fear you. We think of fear is like an enemy against us. But I do think there's a sense of righteous fear. The fear a child has. My parent, I couldn't eat or sleep or live without my parent. I fear them. I'm going to do what they say. If you think about it as a child, one of the reasons when you're big and they're small, they do what you say is because you're big and they're small. Now, as your kids get older, you've all been there. I've been there with my teenage kids. They come to that point where they're a little bit bigger. They're a little bit stronger. And literally for the most animal of reasons, I'm almost as big as you. I could push back against you. All of a sudden, they don't listen like they should. And they're not really that much smarter. And they probably should listen to us, but they don't. And that's kind of what he's saying here. And if you take that comparison of parent to child, think how much bigger the difference is between God to human. Yet we want to kind of do the same thing as an impetuous young teenager. We want to go, God, I know. I'm not afraid of you. I know my own. But as Job says here, the true beginning of understanding is when you realize that's when you're doing. And a healthy fear of God brings us to humility, which allows us to find wisdom. Oh, that I were as in the months past, as in the days when God watched over me. He felt abandoned. When his lamp shone upon my head, and why by his light I walk through darkness. When I went out to, now he's being a little melancholy. Now who knows where he's at right now? His skin's all torn down. He's lost everything. I imagine a beggar that used to be a doctor and got hooked on pain meds, which I met someone like that once, and has lost everything. And they see all these nice things going by. They're reminiscent about the good old days. When I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid. And the aged arose and stood. The princes refrained from talking and put their hand on their mouth. The voice of nobles was hushed and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouth. Like I was well known. I was important. People looked at me in awe. And then what happens? But now they mock at me. Men younger than I, whose fathers I disdained to put with the dogs of my flock. People that before I wouldn't have even, put their fathers with my dogs. I like my dogs too much. Those very same people are now looking down on me and mocking him. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. In a weird way, Job 30 is just kind of a summary of when he first had everything taken away and he couldn't understand it and everything that's gone since. And then he says, I cry out to you, but you don't answer me. I'm trying to understand this. You don't talk to me. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has my soul not grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and I can't rest. And he can't understand why, because in his mind, he's done everything that he should do. And then he can't help himself, like we all do. He begins to justify himself. He begins to look at all the good things he has done. I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? He literally guarded his eyes. He would not look upon young women that he shouldn't be. If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales that God may know my integrity. He's so sure that he was always honest. He's willing to let God be the judge of whether he was or not, to lay that on the scales, so to speak. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity, deserving of judgment. But I haven't done those things. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of a widow to fail, or eaten my morsel myself, he's saying, I've done none of that. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, he's even saying, I loved my enemies, or lifted myself up when evil found him. Indeed, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul, even my enemies. So here we are, back and forth with his friends. His friends going, well, maybe you're not as justified as you think you are. Maybe you aren't as good as you think you are. Job going, well, yes, I am. Look at all the good I've done. Well, maybe I haven't. 1 minute he understands the futility of arguing with God, and the next minute he feels the need to argue with God. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then where does he end up? I don't understand. Where does he end up? Where we always do with pride. Look at me. Look at what I've done. Look how good I am. Automatically sets us above others, automatically puts us at the level of God, automatically puts us in a perch that it's very hard to be honest with ourselves. And then at the end of it, I loved how this ends. The words of Job are ended. I like how that's put. It's kind of a way to put the word of a man is ended. Almost like the words of Job are our words when we're going through bad times. Now, when we come back, we're going to start with Job 32. We're heading towards the end. His friends are going to come back and try to point out what he's doing. But here's my thought for you at the end of this. And I hope you're seeing this as I go through this and see some of the words. The struggles that you have, the questions you have for God, and the hard ones when you seem to be doing everything right, yet everything seems to be going wrong. It's not new. It's not new. But in some way, it's just as futile as it was at the time of Job. And maybe ask yourself this, when I'm spending all this time justifying myself, when I spend all this time looking at what's wrong in the world and what's right about me, what should I be spending my time doing? What should I be doing in that moment? What is the thing that's going to bring me peace? Maybe it's humility. I think back to something I forget all the time. And I believed it then and I believe it now when I was on my journey searching for God. I came to this understanding that you can only truly pray when you're down on your knees, when you're willing to listen, when instead of feeling like you know what's best for yourself, when you know what's best for others and you're telling God what you want. It's when you're listening, when you're down on your knees that you truly find yourself able to come into the presence of God. And maybe it's because the presence of God can only be received, can only be accepted in our humility. And that's the kind of thing that, the words of a man, the words of Job, it's hard to understand because it has nothing to do with what you've done, has nothing to do with what other people are doing, has nothing to do with are you righteous or are you unrighteous. It has to do with one thing. Are you ready to receive God? Are you ready to receive that thing that cannot be explained, that cannot be understood? Ask yourself that. Ponder that, my friends. And join me when we come back with Job part 5. It might be the end, it might not. We're getting close. We'll be starting up with chapter 32. So maybe we'll finish in part 5, or maybe there'll be a part 6. I don't know. But stick here with me. Share this with your friends. Thanks for joining me on something I think about all the time. You might wonder, why am I going through Job? Because it's the number one thing I deal with when I'm traveling, because I hear and see and help others deal with the worst that can happen to human beings. When you're dealing with first responders, when you're dealing with veterans in the military, eventually you're going to hear about bad things being done to good people. You're going to hear about innocence being stripped away from the innocent. And it leaves you wondering, what's the point of all this? Because that's all around us. And so maybe just hearing this, being with me as we go through this, it's just bringing you a little bit of comfort, maybe a little bit of peace, just knowing you're not alone in those same questions. And maybe, just maybe, in the next part 4, part 5, or 6 if it happens, we'll find some answers to that. So I'm Silouan. It's great to be with you. Peace.